Athens, the world's first democracy, the most glorious city in the ancient world. A city of wealth and power, the center of a mighty naval empire. At the head of this state stood one man, a man who seemed to embody all the Athenians' achievements, Pericles. But Pericles would now risk everything he and the Athenians had built in one great gamble. A war that he hoped would make Athens the undisputed ruler of the Mediterranean. This conflict would indeed transform Athens, but in a way Pericles could never have imagined. It would make this man, a common Athenian named Socrates, into the ruler of an extraordinary new empire. An empire that remains the Greeks' last great legacy. An empire of the mind. In the year 431 BC, the city-state of Athens was the greatest power in the Mediterranean. Under the leadership of the patrician Pericles, this tiny state had built a naval empire that stretched across the Aegean. Her mighty fleet of trireme warships was the most powerful of the day. Athens lay at the center of a great trading network that dealt in goods from as far afield as Britain in the west and India in the east, bringing untold wealth into the city. And Pericles had personally devoted himself to making this city the most glorious of the ancient world. He had commissioned the Parthenon, a mighty temple to the goddess Athena, one of the most extravagant monuments in ancient history. But for all his power and sway, Pericles did not rule this city. For Athens was a democracy. This is the assembly area of the Pnyx, home of Athenian democracy. The system that gave every Athenian citizen a say in the running of their state. Here, Pericles had to stand before his fellow citizens and win the right to lead. One day in the year 431 BC, Pericles took the podium and presented the Athenians with a bold new plan. A proposal that would offer Athens her final crowning glory. Pericles intended to vanquish Athens' last great rival, the city-state of Sparta. Sparta was the only other Greek state that matched Athens' power. The Spartans ruled all of southern Greece, and they were a fearsome military force. Their citizens were trained from birth in the arts of war. Tension had been building between Athens and Sparta for decades. To Pericles, it was now time to take on this dangerous adversary. To make Athens the undisputed leader of the Mediterranean.
If we go to war, as I think we must, be determined that we are not going to climb down. For it is from the greatest dangers that the greatest glory is to be won.
The assembly embraced Pericles' plan. The Athenians were never once to shrink from a fight.
The ancient Greeks as a whole were not by any stretch of the imagination a peace-loving people. Peace was an interruption of war rather than vice versa, and the Athenians were as bellicose as any other Greeks.
But Pericles knew that any war with Sparta would not be easy to win. For the Spartan infantry were far superior to Athens' forces. Athens' strength lay in her navy. So Pericles proposed a strategy of astonishing complexity and sophistication. He convinced the Athenians to abandon all the land around Athens and retreat behind the great long walls that stretched down from the city to its harbor at Piraeus. Pericles would supply the city by sea. Merchantmen would bring in grain, wheat, and other essential supplies from Athens' colonies and allies across the Mediterranean. Protected by the mighty Athenian fleet. And Pericles would use this great navy to attack the Spartans from the coast. It was a strategy based on a set of finely judged assumptions.
Pericles' expectation was that after a year or two, but no more than 3, the Spartans would realize that they could not win the war because the Athenians would never give them the infantry battle they needed in order to win, and they had no other device available.
Athens' fleet had always been key to the city's success. It had won the city great military victories, and it had built her an empire. Pericles was sure that this fleet could now bring Athens her greatest triumph. The Athenians crowded behind the city walls. Confident in their vision of imperial power and glory, they assumed that Pericles' strategy could only bring them victory. But among this teeming multitude could be found one man who refused to assume anything. A man unique in Athenian society. A man called Socrates. But as Socrates spent his days in debate, his city was fighting a war. The Spartans invaded Athenian territory and set about burning all the farmland around the city. The Athenians became increasingly anxious. They could only watch from the city walls as their fields and crops were destroyed. But such was Pericles' reputation, he managed to convince the Athenians to stick with his plan. The city could rely on her fleet and shipments from overseas to survive. Little did Pericles know that this fleet now carried an even greater threat. One year into the war, the grain boats that fed the city brought with them an additional cargo: plague. a disease that would now devastate Athens.
Pericles' plan couldn't anticipate difficulties that we now would suggest were rather likely in those circumstances of crowding. And the results were horrendous.
With the population crammed behind the city walls, the affliction spread like wildfire. The symptoms were horrific. The Athenian historian Thucydides, who lived through these years, recorded its effects.
The body was suddenly seized, first with violent heats around the head and redness and inflammation of the eyes, and then the disease descended into the bowels, producing violent ulceration and uncontrollable diarrhea. The sufferings of individuals seemed almost beyond the capacity of human nature.
The city must have looked terrible, smelled terrible, been awful to be in, and terror must have reigned everywhere.
Sufferers, racked with fever and overcome with unquenchable thirst, would crawl into the city cisterns and water mains to die. Thucydides witnessed the scene in Athens streets.
The bodies of dying men lay one upon another, and half-dead creatures reeled about the streets. The catastrophe became so overwhelming that men cared nothing for any rule of religion or law.
The plague's effects on Athens were absolutely devastating. The whole fabric of Athenian society broke down. Morally, people saw no point in being good. Why be good if the good and the evil die just as easily?
The plague would kill over a third of Athens' population. And then it struck the city's figurehead, Pericles. Plutarch, Pericles' biographer, described his symptoms.
The plague seized Pericles, not with sharp and violent fits, but with a dull and lingering distemper, wasting the strength of his body and undermining his noble soul.
By the end, the patrician hero of the city was reduced to relying on potions and magic in an attempt to cure himself.
He showed one of his friends a charm that a woman had hung around his neck, as if to say that he was very sick indeed when he would admit of such foolery as this.
Finally, after 6 months of lingering illness, Pericles died in 429 BC. Pericles had planned to make Athens into the Mediterranean's greatest power. But his carefully calculated strategy had brought only disease and death.
Like most brilliant men, like most people who have had great success all their lives, Pericles simply underestimated the degree to which some things are out of the control of the very best intelligence and the very best knowledge that there are.
Pericles' death would have far-reaching consequences. It soon became clear that this one man had been the linchpin of the Athenian state. Plutarch records that the changes were swift and dramatic.
Those who, while he lived, had resented Pericles' great authority, now realized that he had been the main protector of public safety. So great a corruption and such a flood of mischief and vice followed.
The flaws in Athenian democracy now became apparent. Without a single strong leader, countless figures now scrambled for the top position. And they were prepared to do anything the people wanted if it gave them power.
Pericles' successors, who now wanted to occupy the top position, simply followed the prejudices and passions of the masses in order to gain support.
Athenian democracy now revealed a new and terrifying potential. The potential to slide into mob rule. Crippling her ability to fight a war. As the conflict raged on, an Athenian naval force won a skirmish with the Spartans in rough and storm-tossed seas. The generals who had commanded the force returned to Athens expecting a hero's welcome. Instead, they were thrown into prison. The storm had forced the Athenian commanders to sail straight back to Athens, without picking up any of their soldiers who had fallen overboard during the battle. Rabble-rousing speakers had convinced the assembly that this failure to rescue the men was a crime so appalling that all the generals should be summarily tried and executed. We know of only one man who stood up and attempted to calm the fevered assembly. Socrates.
Socrates alone, and against the very, very serious and vocal and aggressive and mad, furious reaction of the public, stood his ground and said it was the wrong thing to do. He was going to vote against it.
Socrates' principle of questioning the society he lived in now had a real and practical purpose.
He refused to bow to any pressure and thought for himself and do the thing that his conscience and his reasoning told him was the right thing to do.
But in the end, Socrates was only one voice amongst the multitude, and he could not sway the assembly. The generals were condemned to death by drinking poisonous hemlock. It would be a terrible loss to Athens' war effort. With the assembly in the hands of self-interested despots, once mighty Athens began to lose her way.
After the death of Pericles, Athens never again had a political leader with a well-thought-out general picture or a set of goals that he could pursue with reasonable hope of bringing them to fruition.
The war against Sparta degenerated into a bitter, dragging conflict that spread over a decade. The Spartans ravaged the land around Athens. and the Athenian fleet kept the city supplied. Neither side was able to defeat the other. Deprived of victory, the Athenians grew increasingly frustrated. Were they not the greatest state in all of Greece? Surely the time must come for Athens to prove her power once and for all. Then, in the year 416 BC, a daring proposal was put before the assembly. A proposal which, even if it did not defeat the Spartans, would at least satisfy Athens' hunger for glory. A small Greek colony on the island of Sicily had asked for protection. Protection from a neighbor allied with Sparta. Why should the Athenians not come to their aid, humiliate their Spartan adversary, and perhaps conquer all of Sicily at the same time? As one Athenian addressed the assembly,
"This is the way we won our empire, and this is the way all empires have been won. Let us set out on this expedition, for it will destroy the arrogance of the Spartans, and at the same time we shall become rulers of all Greece."
It was a bold plan to be executed on a vast scale, requiring a great fleet of warships and a landing force of over 10,000 men. The Athenians threw themselves into the project with fervor. Armorers beat out new weapons. Soldiers tested out their equipment. Stores were loaded onto a fleet of Athenian triremes, and the shipwrights prepared their vessels for the sea. Then, to great fanfare, the mighty invasion force set out for Sicily. Six months later, word came back. The campaign was not going as quickly as hoped. They needed reinforcements. And then, nothing. No news at all. Then, in the autumn of 413 BC, a sailor arrived in the city. A man who needed a haircut. And as he talked to his barber, he told an appalling tale of a vast and terrible slaughter. It was the story of an invading army that had been pinned down where it landed, of how its leaders had argued with each other about strategy, of how their food and water had run out, of how they'd attempted to ford a great river in a desperate attempt to escape.
They rushed into it, all discipline lost, and every man wanting to cross first. They fell over each other and trod each other underfoot, and they drank thirstily. The water was foul, but still they went on drinking, mud, blood and all, the dead lying thick in the riverbed.
This was how the Athenians discovered that they had been the victims of one of the greatest defeats in ancient history. Over 50,000 men had been killed or taken prisoner. 2 entire fleets of Athens' prized triremes had been destroyed.
The Sicilian campaign is a mess for a variety of reasons. First of all, it's a long way away. It's over 600 or 700 miles. Once they arrive, they squabble and fight about what to do. But perhaps the biggest problem is there's not a tactical reason to do it. There's not a strategic reason to do it. The motivation is highly self-interested.
The Athenians, entranced by a vision of imperial glory, had in fact engaged in a pointless and vain campaign.
They believed wrongly they could go quickly in, raise the countryside, and win a quick victory and a rich tributary subject state.
Thucydides recorded the scale of the devastation.
This was the most notorious action that we know of in Greek history, for they were absolutely, calamitously defeated. The losses were total. Army, navy, everything was destroyed.
With Athens' military power now crippled, her enemies began to close in. The Persians, whom the Athenians had humiliated 50 years before, now saw the ideal opportunity for revenge. They approached the Spartans with the offer of help.
The Persians have been watching this carefully, and they decide to intervene and subsidize the Spartans, and that subsidy is in the form of manpower for rowing and fleet construction.
Where previously the Spartans had never been a naval nation, now they had a fleet paid for with Persian gold. With Athens' navy decimated by the defeat in Sicily, the Spartans could now blockade the Athenian harbors. The great grain convoys from Egypt and the colonies could no longer get through. And finally, the Athenians began to starve in the streets. The people turned to their patron goddess, Athena. At the height of Athens' glory only 30 years before, Pericles had honored her with the most glorious temple ever seen. But the goddess could offer no help now. Athens, once so sure of her preeminence in the Greek world, was now home to a population ravaged by plague and war, besieged and starving. With her treasuries empty and her once proud fleet crippled. In 404 BC, Athens finally surrendered to the Spartan commander, Lysander. The Spartans' terms were heavy. The great walls which had defended the city were to be torn down. Her fleet was to be destroyed.
We had this wonderful scene of Lysander sailing into the Piraeus and dismantling the Athenian fleet. That's important because the destruction is symbolically a destruction of the Athenian Empire.
What remained of Athens' mighty navy was put to the torch, with only 12 ships allowed to remain. No longer would she rule the Mediterranean.
The Athenians became convinced that they could do, finally, in the end, more than they really could. And I think this is really the point in which the potential that Athenian democracy brought about could turn to tragedy. They could achieve great things, they could not achieve all great things.
But it would still take one more act of vanity and violence before the Athenians could redeem themselves. And their city could be reborn.